Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, April 25th, 2021, and today I want to talk to you guys about Democrat Joe Cunningham, a former representative from the state of South Carolina from the 1st Congressional District, who is set to announce his bid for South Carolina governor tomorrow, pointing that South Carolina is now a state that the Democratic Party will have at least a moderately strong Democratic candidate. Joe Cunningham announcing tomorrow will be probably one of the more bigger political events of this month. I think it should be fairly interesting to see what actually happens in South Carolina, because Joe Cunningham actually is a representative who used to represent a Republican district, had a lot of crossover appeal that the Democratic Party might be looking at as a potential way of narrowing up the governor election relative to 2018. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Joe Cunningham is going to win this South Carolina governorship. I'm pointing it out because I think that this is the start of a trend that we are going to see around the nation where the Democratic Party will not let any race go unchallenged. And I think that this ultimately derives from the Stacey Abrams formula that was outlined in the state of Georgia in an effort to drive up turnout and build the foundation for future Democratic victories. As Stacey Abrams put it through the runoff election, that you must fight for every single race, every local race, every state legislature race, every county commissioner race, whatever it is, you must put up a candidate. Otherwise, people will not have a party to fight for. People will not have a party to vote for. If the Democratic Party is only going for a few competitive races, at the end of the day, some voters are going to feel as if the Democratic Party is only worrying about these competitive races and not necessarily fielding the best candidates and potentially winnable candidates in otherwise what are deemed to be likely or safe districts. And I think that this ties back to the Georgia Senate runoff elections and the presidential election results in Georgia. I think that the Democratic Party is looking at Georgia and saying it has a very similar demographic breakdown as South Carolina, which I will show you in just a few moments, where you can argue that based off the demographic data, they should be equally competitive. However, the campaigns and the strategies of both parties have been different in South Carolina versus Georgia. On top of that, Georgia just seems to be moving further to the left and quicker to the left than South Carolina has over the past few elections. But looking at this bid for governor from Joe Cunningham, I think this is the start of many major campaign announcements in states that might not necessarily be winnable, for example, South Carolina, but gives people a candidate to fight for, which means in the future, maybe not this year, maybe not 2022, maybe not 2026, but potentially 2030, when you have a formidable candidate on the Democratic side, and the Democratic Party actually is inspired by someone, it's going to make them want to fight for it even more. If you have a sacrificial lamb every single time, nobody's really going to be inspired by the time it really matters. But if you're fielding strong candidates every single time, eventually one of them are going to win. But it's rarely ever going to be a one-off situation. It requires effort and decades of this foundation being laid. And I think that this is the start of major announcements across the nation that are going to be favorable for the Democratic Party, because they are going to try to replicate what happened here with Stacey Abrams. Because I do honestly think Joe Cunningham knows in the back of his head that chances are he's not winning this governorship. The Republican Party has already said, bring on the challenge, because they know that South Carolina is inherently a Republican state. But the Democrats might look at it a little bit differently. And while they will recognize that they probably won't be winning South Carolina in 2022, they're looking at it as a potential future pickup for the Democratic Party. On your screen right now, you're looking at the census data for the state of Georgia. 60% of the residents are white, 33% are black, and the rest are broken up between American Indian, Asian, Native Hawaiian, 2 or more races, Hispanic, Latino, etc. But if you're looking at the census data for South Carolina, you'll actually get some very similar results. Now, while the white alone percentage does go up by around 8 points, the black percentage does go down, by 6 points. But the main thing is that the percentage of black citizens in South Carolina is much higher than the national average, means that the state probably should have at least a somewhat competitive nature. There are whiter states with more Democratic votes. So it does come down to, number one, bringing out voters to actually get out and vote. I think Obama did a very good job at that in South Carolina that Biden and Clinton did not. In addition, it's still going to be difficult when the overwhelming majority of the state is white. And as we all know, that white voters are the only racial demographic group that backs the Republican Party. So South Carolina isn't necessarily right there with Georgia, but certainly is around the same region and certainly has very similar demographic breakdowns. And I think that Joe Cunningham is going to look at this and say, well, I'm going to try to tap into the 28%, 27% of black residents in South Carolina because that is the most reliable Democratic voting group. But let's talk about a little bit of history in the state of South Carolina in terms of how Republican it actually is. And I think that it is worth pointing out just because, we do need to understand where Joe Cunningham is at this point. While he was someone who won a House race before, let me show you that actually, and then we'll go into the governorship. I just want to say that winning a House race is very different than winning on the statewide level. But in the first congressional district in South Carolina in 2016, 5 years ago, the first district went to Mark Sanford, the incumbent Republican here, by over 20 points. He won 59% of the vote to the Democratic Party's 37. Then he's out. 2 years later, the Democratic Party picks it up, and it comes from Joe Cunningham. He picks up this race, and the reason why this was actually watched was because Mark Sanford was ousted as the incumbent representative. He was primaried, and because he no longer, and the Republicans no longer had the factor of the incumbency, and probably with a number of other things, Joe Cunningham came on top. Isn't that interesting? Looking at the strategy of Katie Arrington, she came into this race being the more Make America Great Again, the more pro-Trump candidate, and then ousted the Republican incumbent because obviously that will be much more popular amongst the Republican Party, so you can make it through a primary, but once you reach the general, that's when things started to get wobbly. So where a Republican previously was winning by over 20 points, South Carolina's first congressional district went to the Democrats. And while 2020 was an exceptional year for the Republicans in the House, they flipped 15 seats from the Democratic Party. The Democrats only had one real pickup because 2 of them were given to them by a court-ordered redistricting process. Joe Cunningham lost South Carolina's first district not by a lot. He only lost by 1.2%. And I know he still lost, and I'm not trying to say or take away from Nancy Mace's victory, but I'm not going to say the first district has all of a sudden returned to its, before Trump numbers, because that's not how it was. In 2016, it was won by 20. In 2020, 4 years later, it was won by 1. Interesting. And then if you look at South Carolina, though, on a statewide level, and I'll talk about why this Joe Cunningham figure is someone who the Democrats would view as more competitive than other Democrats, but not necessarily winnable, is strictly because of how Republican South Carolina is. Now, the reason why I also want to draw the difference between Georgia and South Carolina in 2012, not difference, actually, similarity for this, is because Georgia and South Carolina weren't too far off in terms of their overall percentage back in 2012. Obama had lost the state of Georgia by 8 points, but lost the state of South Carolina by just a little bit more, by 10.6%. So you're talking about a difference of 2.6% in terms of the overall percentage. That's interesting. South Carolina and Georgia were nearly as Republican back in 2012. Well, Georgia is now a state with 2 Democratic senators and just went to Biden on the presidential level. But then fast forward to 2016. South Carolina actually takes a little bit of a turn in favor of the right, going to Donald Trump by 14.2%, and then Georgia only goes to Trump by around 5 points, 5.1%. Go ahead and look at 2020 and looking at the election results there in South Carolina. Donald Trump wins the state, but by, again, a narrower amount than 2016. He wins the state by around just under 13 or 12 percentage points. It was 11 point, what is that? 11.6%, 11.5%. Overall, looking at the numbers in South Carolina, it's not good for the Democrats, but it's certainly not the worst. It was 11.7%, by the way, I just checked. And, South Carolina, while not necessarily in reach, is a state that the Democrats might look at and say, we should field a strong candidate now, so that way in the future, with a state that is increasing in terms of minority vote and potentially could be tapped into the future, they need someone strong now. Joe Cunningham has a large amount of time ahead of him to run for political office. This will not be his last bid for something in South Carolina. He could run for Senate. He could run for representative again. Chances are for 2022, he has a better way of making a name for himself by running for governor rather than running for representative, just because many people are expecting it to be a red wave year. But if you're looking at the 1st congressional district, the reason why he's being, propped up in this race as well is not because he would only offer that Stacey Abrams type of strategy, but in addition to that, he actually had more crossover appeal than the Democrat who only lost by 8 points back in 2018 statewide. So if we look here, what you might notice is that let's look if we can find the crossover appeal mention. It says the Democrat James Smith secured 46% of the votes statewide, and Cunningham actually outdid Smith in 2018. Smith lost by 4 points in South Carolina's 1st, but Cunningham won by 1.5%. He did better than Biden by 5 points in South Carolina's 1st district. Looking at the South Carolina election results in 2018, well, the incumbent, first of all, here is not term limited, so he did run for re-election back in 2018. And Henry McMaster actually only won by 8 points. I don't think this was really talked about too heavily. I mean, South Carolina went to the Republican Party, by a comparable margin to the one in Michigan. In fact, South Carolina went less for the GOP than Michigan, South Carolina's margin for the GOP was smaller than the Democratic Party's margin in Michigan, or the Democratic Party's margin in Pennsylvania or Minnesota. I mean, it's quite interesting to see how the margins have really, they have very different results. So James Smith running against Henry McMaster didn't nearly win, but came within 8 points. That's certainly something to be proud about. 8 points in South Carolina. Wow. And if you're just looking at Joe Cunningham, well, it seems as if he outperformed James Smith in that 1st district, a district with a large population here, 900,000 residents in the district. So if you're looking at it and saying, wait a second, or 800,000, but you're looking at it saying, James Smith came within 8 points, yet lost the district by 4. In that same year, Cunningham won by 1.5. What would have happened had all the other districts been the same and Cunningham was that candidate and not James Smith? Now, I'm not going to fuel any type of speculation into the Democratic Party winning the governor race in 2022. Chances are it might be similar to 2014, where it's a pretty large margin. But if you're looking at the results here back in 2014, and you're looking at them in 2018, both of them are Republican victories. Both of them are pretty large, I would say. Not necessarily within swing state territory. But, here's the thing about South Carolina. I think it's worth it for the Democratic Party to run Joe Cunningham. Based off the strategy that I might have, shunned away back in 2019, 2020 before the election, because we hadn't seen Georgia as a prime example of this working, I think the Democrats should run Joe Cunningham, politically speaking, just to get someone out there that the Democratic Party can canvass for, can phone bank for, that won't just be this sacrificial lamb that both parties in, off years tend to put up simply because they need someone to run, but it just isn't enough. When you have a candidate who doesn't really care much about their race, chances are people are not going to be inspired for this party in the future. If you find a South Carolina governor bid, Democrat, a random Democrat from across the state, a random state senator, a state representative that, number one, doesn't really have the heart for it and is just running because the statewide Democratic Party has asked him to, that's not what's happening here with Joe Cunningham. Joe Cunningham seems to be running because he truly has his heart in it, but I do think that, logically speaking, him and the Democratic Party in South Carolina recognize that he probably isn't going to win it. But I think this is the start of a major strategy nationwide for recognizable Democrats to announce and run for elections that are previously viewed as unattainable. And while still may be unattainable, every race is worth fighting for. Every race is worth fighting for. Georgia can tell you that. If you looked at the previous election results in Georgia, you might have written it off. In 2016, Raphael Warnock's seat was won by 13 points by the GOP. David Perdue won his election as a non-incumbent back in 2014 by nearly 8 points. And then you fast forward to 2021, the Democrats win the House, win the presidency. Someone needs to be a check on them. Well, it doesn't end up being Georgia because they elect two Democrats. This was not easily fought for. This was a state that was fought for the past decade. Beyond that, expedited largely by Stacey Abrams, but a strategy that the Democratic Party never really gave up on Georgia, despite it seemingly being a solid red state, as recently as 2004, 2008 practically, 2012. These were states I wouldn't say safe in 2008 or 2012, but certainly likely states for the GOP. Not necessarily in reach. When Biden was last on the ballot, the Democrats lost Georgia by 8 points before 2020. So it takes a long time to fight for the states, and it takes a lot of groundwork and a lot of strong campaigning. And that's what I think the South Carolina Democratic Party is doing here. I realistically don't think that Joe Cunningham is going to win this governor bid. I think that if he does, it'll be one of the biggest upsets that we've seen so far, especially in the South, but I don't think it's necessarily in reach. Could they do it? Maybe, but I'm not going to bet on it whatsoever. So if we're looking at what Joe Cunningham is doing, it's probably not trying to necessarily outright win, but make a name for the South Carolina Democratic Party, inspire voters, build networks, create community outreach, start a trend of consistently checking in on voters, registering voters, making Democrats have a reason to fight for South Carolina. I understand it's a largely Republican state, but Georgia was not too far away back in 2012, and look at it now. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.